This performance is unacceptable. You have failed this exam, and frankly, I expected better from you.
The sound of a failing grade isn't a noise. It isn't a crash or a bang or a shout. It is a vacuum. It is the sudden, violent removal of air from a room that holds 300 people. It is the silence that follows the drop of a single sheet of paper onto a polished mahogany desk, a sound so soft it shouldn't register, yet it echoes like a gavel strike in the canyon of a lecture hall. Marcus stood there, the navy blue cotton of his hoodie absorbing the harsh, artificial light of the projector, a sharp contrast to the sea of gray wool and tweed that surrounded him. He looked at the paper. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He just stared at the red ink that marred the complex, beautiful architecture of his equations. The letter F was slashed across the page with a violence that felt personal, a jagged scar over hours of sleepless nights, over weekends sacrificed to the library, over the quiet, relentless hum of ambition that kept him moving when the rest of the world was asleep. This wasn't just a grade. In this environment, in this cathedral of higher learning where the walls were lined with the portraits of men who would have never let Marcus in the front door 50 years ago, this was a statement. Professor Sterling stood a few feet away, his chest heaving slightly, his face flushed with a performative indignation that felt rehearsed, as if he had been waiting all semester for this specific moment. The air in the room was heavy, suffocating. You could feel the eyes of the other students, 300 pairs of eyes boring into Marcus's back. Some were pitying, sure, but many held that cold, detached curiosity of people watching a car crash from the safety of a sidewalk. They were waiting for the reaction. They were waiting for the angry black man. They were waiting for the outburst that would confirm every silent bias they had nursed since the first day Marcus walked into advanced quantum mechanics and sat in the front row. But Marcus didn't give it to them. He held the silence. He held it like a physical weight, balancing the injustice of the moment on shoulders that had been trained to carry much heavier burdens than the ego of an insecure academic. He looked at the equation he had solved, the derivation he knew was correct, and then he looked up at Sterling. The professor's anger was loud, filling the space with accusations of incompetence, of hubris, of wasting the university's time. But beneath the shouting, Marcus heard the fear. He heard the terrifying realization of a man who looks at a student and sees not a pupil, but a replacement. The paper trembled slightly in the draft of the air conditioning, but Marcus's hand was steady. He took a breath, measuring it, controlling the rate of his heart, refusing to let the adrenaline dictate his movements. This was the moment. The hook wasn't the failure itself. It was the audacity of the lie that said he didn't belong here, the lie that said his mind, sharp as a diamond and just as hard, was incapable of grasping the concepts that Sterling guarded like a jealous dragon. Marcus looked at the F again. It looked less like a grade and more like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down on the dusty floor of academia. And Marcus, in his navy hoodie, with the calm expression of a man who knows the truth is on his side, prepared to pick it up. To understand the weight of that silence in the lecture hall, you have to understand the noise that preceded it. Not the noise of crowds, but the noise of effort, the grinding, mechanical hum of a mind pushing itself beyond the red line, night after night. Marcus didn't just study, he besieged the material. He treated every textbook like a fortress that needed to be breached, every theory like a code that needed to be cracked. For the last 4 years, his life had been a series of long exposures in the university library. While his peers were networking at mixers or sleeping off the excesses of the weekend, Marcus was sitting in the corner of the 4th floor, the spot where the Wi-Fi was strongest and the distractions were fewest. He knew the janitorial staff by name. He knew the rhythm of the heating pipes as they clanked into life at 3 a.m. He knew the specific quality of the silence that falls over a campus when the snow begins to stick. This wasn't just about grades for him. It was about survival. It was about the unspoken contract he had signed with his mother, with his grandmother, with every ancestor who had worked with their hands so that he could work with his mind. He wore that navy hoodie like armor. It was a choice, a deliberate rejection of the pretenses that governed this place. He didn't need the elbow patches or the loafers to understand the curvature of space-time. He needed the math, and the math was pure. That was what he loved about it. The math didn't care where you came from. It didn't care about your zip code or the balance in your bank account. It didn't care about the color of your skin. An equation was either balanced or it wasn't. Truth was binary. It was absolute. In a world full of gray areas and shifting social goalposts, physics was his anchor. But the isolation took a toll. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being the only one in the room. It's a low-frequency hum of anxiety, a constant surveillance of the self. Am I speaking too loudly? Is my tone too aggressive? Did I ask that question correctly? Marcus had learned to navigate these invisible tripwires with the grace of a bomb disposal expert. He modulated his voice. He softened his posture. He made himself smaller so that his intelligence wouldn't be perceived as a threat. But inside the fire was raging. Inside, he was building a cathedral of knowledge, brick by mental brick. He had read Sterling's old papers. He had found the gaps in them, the slight logical leaps that had been glossed over by peer reviewers dazzled by Sterling's reputation. Marcus wasn't failing, he was transcending. And that perhaps was the problem. He had worked too hard to be mediocre. He had sacrificed too much to be average. When he looked in the mirror in the harsh fluorescent light of the library bathroom at dawn, splashing cold water on his face to stay awake for an 8 a.m. lab, he didn't see a victim, he saw a contender. He saw someone who had paid the price of admission in sweat and lost sleep. So when that grade landed, it didn't just hurt his GPA, it insulted his history. It spat on those nights in the library. It tried to erase the thousands of hours of unseen labor that had built the man standing in that hoodie. And that was something Marcus could not forgive.
Professor Sterling was not a villain from a cartoon. He didn't twirl a mustache. He didn't use slurs. His malice was far more sophisticated, refined by decades of tenure and shielded by the thick walls of academic tradition. He was the gatekeeper. Every institution has them. Men who believe that their primary function is not to teach, but to filter, to protect the sanctity of the discipline from those they deem unfit. And unfit, in Sterling's lexicon, was a flexible term that often aligned with demographics he found uncomfortable. The meeting before the failure was brief. Marcus had gone to office hours, a draft of his final paper in hand, seeking guidance on a complex derivation regarding nonlinear temporal dynamics. He had expected a critique. He had expected a debate. Instead, he got a dismissal. Sterling hadn't even looked at the math. He had looked at Marcus, his eyes skimming over the hoodie, the sneakers, the quiet confidence, and he had sighed. A long, weary sigh that smelled of stale coffee and condescension. "Mr. Holloway," he had said, removing his glasses and cleaning them slowly, a power move designed to make Marcus wait. "There is a difference between ambition and delusion. This work, it requires a certain pedigree of thought, a certain intuitive grasp of the abstract that I'm afraid simply cannot be forced." He spoke the words gently, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. It was the soft bigotry of low expectations, weaponized and wrapped in the tweed of concern. He wasn't telling Marcus he was wrong. He was telling Marcus he was incapable. He was suggesting that the very structure of Marcus's brain was incompatible with the high-altitude air of theoretical physics. Perhaps, Sterling had suggested, pushing the paper back across the desk without turning a page, you would be more comfortable in the engineering department, something more practical, something more hands-on. The implication hung in the air like smoke. You are a laborer, not a thinker. You are built for tools, not for theories. Marcus had taken the paper back. He hadn't argued. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply looked at Sterling and said, "I think I'll stay right where I am, Professor." That was the moment the war began. That was the moment Sterling decided that Marcus had to be made an example of. It wasn't about the math anymore. It was about insubordination. It was about a student who didn't know his place. Sterling saw Marcus's persistence not as a virtue, but as an affront to the natural order of things. The F wasn't an assessment of the work. It was a punitive measure. It was a structural wall erected to stop Marcus in his tracks. But Sterling had made a critical error in his calculations. He assumed that the wall would stop Marcus. He didn't realize that for a man like Marcus, a wall is just another puzzle to be solved, another equation to be unbalanced, another obstacle to be dismantled brick by brick. The institutional wall is tall, and it is cold, and it is built to last.
but it is not invincible, and it had never met a force quite like Marcus Holloway.
The confrontation, when it finally spilled over, was public. It had to be. Sterling needed an audience. He needed to perform the ritual of humiliation to ensure that the lesson stuck, not just for Marcus, but for anyone else who might get ideas about their station. It happened 20 minutes into the lecture. Sterling had paused mid-sentence and turned his gaze toward the third row. "Mr. Holloway," he barked, the sudden volume startling the drowsy room awake. "Since you seem to struggle so profoundly with the fundamental principles of this course, as evidenced by your disastrous final paper, perhaps you'd like to come down here and explain to the class exactly where your logic failed." It was a trap, a cruel, jagged trap designed to strip Marcus naked in front of his peers. The room went deathly silent. This was the nightmare scenario, the public dressing down. Marcus felt the heat rise in his neck, the primal instinct to fight or flee flooding his system. But he did neither. He stood up. He walked down the stairs, his sneakers squeaking softly on the linoleum, the sound echoing in the hush. He stood before the massive blackboard, the white chalk dust swirling in the air like the ashes of failed ideas. Sterling handed him a piece of chalk, a smirk playing on his thin lips. "Go on," Sterling goaded. "Show us your unique interpretation of the Heisenberg constraints." Marcus took the chalk. He turned to the board. He could feel Sterling hovering behind him, radiating malice. He could feel the judgment of the room. But as soon as the chalk touched the slate, something shifted. The fear evaporated. The anger cooled into a hard crystalline focus. Marcus began to write. He didn't write what Sterling wanted. He didn't write the textbook derivation. He wrote his own proof, the one Sterling had refused to read. The chalk clacked rhythmically against the board, a machine gun staccato of logic. Variables, constants, integrals, they flowed from him like a language he had spoken since birth. He moved with a fluidity that was almost like a dance, his mind racing ahead of his hand. He wasn't just solving the problem, he was rewriting the question. He was showing that Sterling's premise was flawed, that the textbook answer was an approximation, a shadow of the real truth. Sterling realized what was happening too late. He stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Stop!" he shouted, slamming his hand against the board, creating a cloud of dust. "This is nonsense. This is gibberish. You are wasting our time with this vandalism." Sterling's voice cracked. He was losing control. He snatched the chalk from Marcus's hand and threw it on the floor. "Get out," Sterling hissed, pointing to the door. "Get out of my classroom. You have failed, Mr. Holloway. You have failed utterly." Marcus stood there, his hands covered in white dust, his chest heaving slightly. He looked at the board. The math was right. He knew it was right. But truth doesn't matter when power holds the eraser. He looked at Sterling, and for the first time, he saw the man for what he was. Small, terrified, obsolete. But the humiliation was still burning, the shame of being dismissed, of being silenced, of being told his truth was garbage. It hung in the air, a toxic cloud that threatened to choke him. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. The wall was too high. But the room wasn't entirely hostile. Unbeknownst to Sterling and unknown to Marcus, there was a witness in the back row. Dr. Eris Thorne had slipped in 10 minutes late, taking a seat in the shadows near the exit. He wasn't a student. He wasn't faculty at this university. He was a visiting scholar, a physicist of international renown, a man whose name appeared in the footnotes of the very textbook Sterling taught from. He was there for a guest lecture later that afternoon, but he had arrived early, curious to see the state of the department. What he saw made his blood run cold, and then hot. He watched the dynamic from the back, the angry, flailing professor and the stoic, hoodie-clad student. He saw the body language. He saw the power imbalance. But more importantly, Dr. Thorne saw the board. He squinted through his wire-rimmed glasses, reading the equations Marcus had scribbled before being stopped. Thorne's mind, honed by 40 years of theoretical research, parsed the logic instantly. He saw the unconventional approach, he saw the risk, and then he saw the brilliance. It wasn't standard, it skipped steps. It used a notation style that was intuitive rather than rote. But the geometry of the thought was flawless. It was elegant. It was the kind of leap that only a young, unencumbered mind makes, a mind that hasn't yet been taught what is impossible. Thorne watched Sterling slop the board. He watched him throw the chalk. He saw the history of exclusion playing out in real time, a scene he had lived himself in the 1980s, a scene his father had lived in the 1950s. The specifics changed, but the song remained the same. The arrogant gatekeeper crushing the budding flower of genius because it grew in a garden he didn't tend. Thorne felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He could have stayed silent. He could have let the moment pass, waited for the lecture to end, and maybe offered the boy a sympathetic word in the hallway. That would have been the polite thing to do. That would have been the professional courtesy. But Eris Thorne had not reached the pinnacle of his field by being polite. He looked at Marcus, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast, the fight draining out of him. He saw a younger version of himself standing there, teetering on the edge of giving up. And he knew, with a certainty that vibrated in his bones, that he could not let that boy walk out of that door carrying the weight of a failure that wasn't his. Thorne placed his briefcase on the floor. He buttoned his jacket. He stood up. The sound of his chair scraping back was loud in the stunned silence of the room. It was the sound of an intervention. It was the sound of the cavalry arriving, not with a sword, but with a credentials list that could level the building. The sound of Dr. Thorne's footsteps was different. It was heavy, rhythmic, authoritative. He walked down the center aisle not like a visitor, but like a landlord coming to inspect the property. "Excuse me," his voice boomed, a rich baritone that commanded the air without needing to shout. "I believe you missed a step, Professor." Sterling spun around, his face flushing a deeper shade of crimson. "Who are you? This is a closed lecture." Thorne didn't stop. He walked right past Sterling, ignoring him as one ignores a barking dog, and stood next to Marcus. He looked the young man in the eye. "Don't erase it," Thorne said softly to Marcus. "Never erase it." Then Thorne turned to the board. He picked up a fresh piece of chalk. "I am Dr. Eris Thorne," he announced to the room, though his eyes were fixed on the equations. A murmur went through the class. The name was legendary. Even Sterling froze, his mouth hanging open, the color draining from his face as recognition set in. "And this young man," Thorne continued, circling the section Marcus had written, "has just derived the chaotic expansion series using a nonlinear variable. It is unconventional." He paused, letting the word hang. Sterling smirked, thinking he had an ally. "Exactly, it's garbage," Sterling interjected. Thorne spun on him, his eyes flashing. "It is unconventional," Thorne repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "because it is 20 years ahead of the textbook you are teaching from." The room gasped. Thorne turned back to the board. With swift, precise strokes, he completed the proof Marcus had started. He showed the bridge between Marcus's logic and the established theory. He showed how Marcus had bypassed 3 pages of redundant calculation to arrive at the truth faster, cleaner, and with more elegance. "He didn't fail the assignment, Professor," Thorne said, addressing the room but pinning Sterling with his gaze. "He solved the paradox you've been trying to explain for the last hour. He just did it in a language you haven't bothered to learn." The reveal was blinding. The math on the board stood as irrefutable evidence. The F on Marcus's paper was now revealed for what it was, a lie. A badge of Sterling's ignorance, not Marcus's incompetence. Thorne capped the chalk and placed it gently on the tray. He turned to Marcus. "What is your name, son?" Marcus swallowed hard, finding his voice. Marcus Holloway." Thorne nodded, a slow, respectful gesture. "Well, Mr. Holloway, it seems you are the one who should be teaching this section." The shift in the room was palpable. The air rushed back in. The students looked from Sterling, small, defeated, clutching his tweed lapels, to Marcus, who stood tall next to the giant of the field. The visiting scholar hadn't just stood up, he had flipped the entire world right side up. The conclusion of a conflict like this isn't a parade. It's a quiet realignment of the universe. Sterling didn't explode, he imploded. He muttered something about interpretation and academic rigor that nobody listened to, and then he retreated. He packed his bag with trembling hands, the authority he had worn like a cloak now tattered and useless at his feet. He left the room quickly, avoiding eye contact with the students he had terrorized, a king in exile within his own kingdom. The students, for their part, were stunned. They looked at the board, then at Marcus, with a new expression. It wasn't just respect. It was a realization of how close they had come to witnessing a tragedy. They had almost watched brilliance be extinguished, and they had been complicit in their silence. Marcus gathered his things. He didn't gloat. He didn't shout, "I told you so." He felt a profound exhaustion, the adrenaline crash leaving him shaky. He zipped up his backpack, the sound distinct in the quiet room. Dr. Thorne was still there, leaning against the desk, watching him. "You have a gift, Marcus," Thorne said, his voice low and warm. "But you also have a target on your back. Talent like yours frightens small men, and this world is full of small men." Marcus nodded. "I know," he said. "I'm learning that." Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock. "I run a research fellowship at the Institute. It starts in the fall. We don't care about textbooks. We care about results. We care about the truth." He handed the card to Marcus. "Apply. Use my name." The handshake that followed was more than a greeting. It was a transmission. It was the passing of a torch. Thorne's hand was rough, warm, and strong. Marcus gripped it back, feeling the solidarity of the gesture. "Thank you," Marcus said, "for seeing me." Thorne smiled, a crinkle of lines around his eyes. "I didn't just see you, young man. I heard you. The math speaks. Always remember that. The math speaks louder than they ever can." As Thorne walked away, Marcus stood alone at the front of the room for a moment. He looked at the empty chair where Sterling had sat. He looked at the board where his work still shone in white dust. The power had shifted. He wasn't the student begging for a grade anymore. He was a scholar who had defended his thesis in the fire. He put the card in his pocket, right next to his heart.